request number 1 engine. Where is it, on the right? Before, there will be nobody on the runway when we get there, right? Nothing? Don't know, I can't tell you for sure.
On July 23, 1983, the pilots of Air Canada Flight 143 didn't dwell too much on the warning light that starts blinking during their journey. But then another bulb lights up, this one telling them of the loss of their engines, and they're hundreds of miles from their destination. Before his fateful flight on Air Canada's Boeing 767, Captain Robert Pearson had ample experience in the cockpit. The 48-year-old had already logged in an excess of 15,000 flight hours, and his first officer, 36-year-old Maurice Quintal, had tallied about half of that too. And on top of this, both men had also logged experiences in a diverse range of aircraft. So what happened with this flight? Well, on July 22, 1983, an Air Canada crew flew the cutting-edge Boeing 767 from Toronto to Edmonton, Canada. After that, a team flew the plane to Montreal. Here, another crew change but Pearson and Quintal at the helm to fly the craft back to Edmonton the next day. At first, though, it seemed that the airmen might not get the flight off the ground. Mechanics realized that the plane had a dangerous fault. A poor soldering job had prevented an internal computer from measuring how much fuel the vessel carried. Yet, although such a disconnection might have been reason enough to ground the flight, the Air Canada ground personnel seemingly had a solution that could allow for liftoff, a manual calculation. They then used dripsticks to measure how much fuel the plane had. But unbeknownst to the crew, they had made a potentially fatal error. The dripsticks may have told the crew the volume of fuel that the aircraft had in its reserves, but the airmen had incorrectly converted the figures from the dripsticks. How did this happen? Well, the crew thought that the plane measured its fuel reserves in kilograms, but in reality it was in pounds, and 1 kilogram is equivalent to about 2.2 pounds. So, when the crew calculated the plane's fuel reserves in kilograms instead of pounds, Air Canada Flight 143 took off with half the amount of fuel that it needed to make its journey. At first, all seemed fine, and when it made its first stop, the ground crews felt understandably delighted. Their calculations had worked so far after all. But it was the second leg of the journey where the crew's mistake would come back to haunt everyone. Just above Red Lake in Ontario, the pilots and the rest of Flight 143 reached an altitude of 41,000 feet, and it was at this point that the plane's warning system lit up. The first bulb brightened to alert the crew that the plane had a fuel pressure problem. It seemed that its left engine's fuel pump had failed. Pearson and Quintal believed they knew how to fix this though. If the fuel pump had broken, the pilots thought they should just turn it off, reasoning that gravity pressing on the plane at 41,000 feet would keep fuel running into the plane's engine regardless of a working pump. So the men switched off the fuel pump. But then moments later, they got another warning. The right engine had lost pressure too. At this point, Pearson and Quintal had a decision to make. They could either ignore the second warning and trust the initial calculations that measured the amount of onboard fuel, or they could phone in an emergency landing. As it happened though, the pilots had a third voice available to weigh into the debate. Air Canada engineer Rick Dion had joined them for the journey across the country. Dion felt that the pilots should heed the warnings, and as it turned out, both pilots agreed with his assessment. So Pearson contacted air traffic control to see if they could divert their journey to Winnipeg. It was there that the pilots planned to make an emergency landing, but then things got worse. The engine on the plane's left side stopped working. As part of his training on a flight simulator though, Pearson had learned how to fly a plane that had lost power in one of its engines. So in the scenario which had suddenly presented itself to him in reality, a landing would be difficult, but not unmanageable. Then, however, an eerie alarm also sounded in the cockpit to indicate that both engines had died. This was something that neither Pearson nor Quintal had ever heard of before. Neither of them had ever practiced landing a plane without any engines either. And to make matters worse, the Boeing 767's controls had gone out because they derived their power from the engines. But the plane's darkened dash hadn't left the pilots completely devoid of information. In fact, Pearson and Quintal had a handful of battery-powered instruments that could help conjure up some kind of landing. The airmen had their vertical speed indicator, for one, and this showed just how quickly the plane had started falling from the sky. a rate of 2,000 feet for every minute. There was barely any time to discuss possible tactics. The pilots had to rely on the plane's remaining resources, including its more primitive flight instruments and its hydraulic system. Airliners of the same scale as the Boeing 767 rely on a hydraulic system for control, you see. These behemoth planes also come with backup plans in case the engine fails and power is consequently cut off to the hydraulic system. In the case of the Boeing 767 then, the craft typically uses a ram air turbine to regain control. A ram air turbine generates power from movement, much like wind turbines spinning in gusty areas around the world. But to land their plane safely, Pearson and Quintal had to reduce its speed. Fortunately, Pearson and Quintal had a second potential solution in mind. It all stemmed from the captain's former life as a glider pilot. First though, he had to figure out the giant plane's most favorable velocity for gliding. Pearson then did his best to fly the Boeing 767 at about 220 knots, or roughly 250 miles per hour as it's made its descent. Meanwhile, Quintal started to do some calculations of his own. He needed to figure out if the plane had enough speed and time to make it all the way from Red Lake to Winnipeg, the airport where they hoped to make an emergency landing. Of course, air traffic controllers had also started to worry when they learned that Pearson and Quintal had lost control and power over their massive vessel.
Winnipeg, Air Canada, flight 143. 143, go ahead. We lost our number 1 engine. We'll require all the trucks out. 143, check, okay.
The crews knew that an overly harsh turn in steering could knock the plane out of its ideal aerodynamic path. And if that happened, the pilots would send their plane into a downward spiral toward the ground. On top of that, air traffic control wasn't entirely sure where the Boeing 767 was.
12 miles from Gimli right now. Is it on the right? I don't know. I can't tell you for sure.
As soon as the plane lost power, its transponder had stopped sending the aircraft's location to the control tower. And while the team did have radar, using it would be unreliable compared to transponder relayed positioning. Aboard the plane though, Quintal had a good idea of where he was thanks to his past experience with the Air Force. Yet his calculations showed that the plane wouldn't make it to Winnipeg in time for a landing. So he suggested that he and Pearson forego their original route in favor of a glide-in landing at his former base at Gimli. Unfortunately, the base had become Gimli Motorsports Park, a civilian hangout with several racing tracks, and at the time that Pearson and Quintal wanted to land their plane, the place was hosting a racing competition, so people had naturally crowded into the venue that day to watch it unfold. But Pearson and Quintal didn't know that until they started to make their final descent onto Gimli, and the onlookers represented just one of two major problems that could make or break the pilot's landing. The second problem related to the fact that they were coming in too high. Such a miscalculation meant that they could miss the landing strip altogether. By this point too, the 61 passengers aboard the Boeing 767 had learned that their plane was in the midst of an emergency landing, and so many of them started to prepare for the worst. They scribbled goodbye notes to family members or set about recording last-minute changes to their wills. But Pearson and Quintal worked in the cockpit to avoid such an enormous tragedy. First, the pilots considered making a complete rotation in the vessel to lessen its velocity and elevation, but the plane didn't have enough height to make it all the way around. So, Pearson was forced to try a glider maneuver that pilots almost never use when landing a commercial airliner. Pearson pushed the plane into what's called a forward slip. This tilted the aircraft to its side as it made its descent, and in such a position, the aircraft lost altitude quickly without increasing its speed. The Boeing 767 then headed towards the ground in almost complete silence. The revelers on the ground consequently had no idea that a commercial jet would be trying to make an emergency landing before them. Instead, they continued their activities as normal. In fact, a pair of boys were riding their bikes no more than 1,000 feet from where Pearson and Quintal hoped to land their powerless plane. The airplane actually came so dangerously close to both kids that the fearful expressions upon their faces could be noted from the cockpit. But thankfully, the people at Gimli had a spot of luck on their sides that day, yet this manifested in ways that might at first have seemed unlucky. The Boeing's landing equipment didn't fix into an appropriate position as the plane made its descent, so when the vessel finally hit the ground and Pearson slammed the brakes, the front wheel crumpled back into the plane. This forced the nose of the 767 into the ground, which created enough friction to slow down the landing. The new racetrack also had built-in safety features that kept the sliding plane from speeding into the crowds of people gathered there. Namely, the plane ran alongside a guardrail at the center of the track, thus creating even more friction. And eventually, the aircraft came to a stop a stunning 17 minutes after exhausting its fuel supplies. Yet, landing didn't mark the end of the ordeal for Pearson, Quintal, and everybody else aboard the Boeing 767. They then had to evacuate the plane, and quickly. After all, a fire could break out and quickly engulf all of them in flames. As they departed the plane via its emergency slides, the racers on the track rushed toward the vessel to put out a small blaze at the nose. Ultimately, everyone got off the plane safely, with nobody suffering major injuries. In the wake of the miraculous landing, though, both Pearson and Quintal faced punishment from Air Canada for allowing such an accident to take place. The captain therefore endured a 6-month demotion, while Quintal served a 2-week suspension. Yet most looked at Pearson and Quintal and their unbelievable efforts as heroic. Quintal eventually became a captain with Air Canada, while Pearson stayed with the company for another decade. And their landing remains a thing of legend. Other flight crews have attempted to make the same landing in flight simulation, and many have failed to glide as these under-pressure airmen did in 1983.